Imagine discovering that your family's most respected ancestor, the man whose portrait hangs proudly in your living room, whose name graces streets and monuments across the South, was living a double life that would shatter everything you believed about honor, dignity, and moral authority. Imagine learning that behind closed doors, this pillar of society was entangled in a web of forbidden desire, political corruption, and human exploitation, so twisted that it would make even his harshest enemies blush with shame. Well, that's exactly what happened to the descendants of John Caldwell Calhoun, one of America's most powerful politicians, when letters surfaced in a dusty Charleston attic that exposed a scandal so explosive it rewrote Southern history. Before we dive into this jaw-dropping revelation, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stick around until the very end, because the most shocking part of this story will leave you speechless. March 18th, 1837. The grand ballroom of the Calhoun mansion buzzed with the finest of Charleston society. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across silk gowns and tailored coats. Politicians, plantation owners, and their perfumed wives sipped champagne while discussing the pressing matters of the day. States' rights, federal overreach, the sacred institution of slavery, all eyes were on their host, the distinguished Vice President John C. Calhoun, as he raised his glass in a toast to Southern values and moral superiority. But what none of those guests knew, what history books would bury for over a century, was that upstairs in the servants' quarters, a young woman named Celeste was waiting. Not waiting to serve, not waiting to clean, but waiting for the man who would sneak through her door once the last guest departed. The same man who had just finished lecturing about the divine order of races, about the natural hierarchy that God himself had ordained. The same man whose political career was built on the foundation that mixing of the races was an abomination against nature itself. John Caldwell. Calhoun wasn't just having an affair. He was having an affair that would expose the rotting hypocrisy at the heart of the antebellum South. An affair that produced children he could never acknowledge. An affair that generated love letters so passionate, so raw, that they would make modern romance novels seem tame by comparison. And when those letters finally saw daylight, they didn't just destroy reputations. They revealed how power, desire, and human bondage created a system so corrupt that even its greatest champions couldn't live by their own rules. The morning sun filtered through heavy drapes as Calhoun adjusted his cravat in the mirror. His reflection stared back, stern, authoritative, the face that had launched 1,000 political campaigns. But behind those calculating eyes lived a secret that gnawed at him like acid. Not guilt over the affair itself, but terror of discovery, terror of losing the power he'd spent decades accumulating, terror that his enemies would use his weakness to destroy not just him, but the entire Southern way of life he'd sworn to protect. Celeste moved through the house like a ghost. To the other servants, she was just another housegirl. To the guests, she was invisible, part of the furniture. But to Calhoun, she was an obsession that threatened everything. She had arrived at the plantation 3 years earlier, purchased from a slave market in Savannah. 16 years old, light-skinned, with eyes that held intelligence no amount of bondage could extinguish. The seller had bragged about her education, her ability to read and write, skills that made her valuable for managing household accounts. What the seller didn't mention, what Calhoun discovered within weeks, was that Celeste possessed something far more dangerous than literacy. She possessed the kind of beauty that made powerful men forget their principles, their wives, their God. The kind of beauty that turned moral crusaders into hypocrites, that transformed champions of racial purity into living contradictions. The affair began slowly, carefully, a lingering glance during breakfast service, a brush of fingers when she handed him correspondence. Conversations that lasted longer than necessary about plantation business. Calhoun told himself it was nothing, just the natural appreciation a man might have for fine property. But late at night, when his wife Sarah slept soundly in their marriage bed, he found himself walking the halls, drawn to the servants' quarters like a moth to flame. Their first kiss happened during a thunderstorm in August. Calhoun had retreated to his study to review legislation when lightning knocked out the power. Celeste appeared with candles, moving through the darkness with practiced grace. When thunder crashed overhead, she flinched, and he reached out to steady her. Their eyes met in the candlelight, and something passed between them that neither could deny. Not master and slave, not white and black, but man and woman, desire and need, the raw human hunger that makes fools of kings and beggars alike. What followed was months of stolen moments, secret meetings, whispered promises in the dark. Calhoun convinced himself he was different from other masters who took their pleasure by force. He courted Celeste with gifts, with gentle words, with promises of eventual freedom. He told her she was special, that what they shared transcended the boundaries society had erected. He wrote her letters filled with passion and poetry, declarations of love that would have scandalized his political allies and destroyed his career. But Celeste was no willing participant in this romance. How could she be? Every touch, every kiss, every whispered endearment was shadowed by the knowledge that she was property, that her body, her heart, her very existence belonged to this man who claimed to love her while keeping her in chains. She played the role he wanted because survival demanded it. She smiled when he visited because refusal meant punishment. She accepted his gifts because they were the only kindness she would ever know in a world designed to crush her spirit. The letters Calhoun wrote reveal a man torn between genuine emotion and monstrous selfishness. In one, dated September 15th, 1837, he poured out his heart. "My dearest Celeste, you have become the sun around which my world revolves. Without you, I am merely a politician spouting empty words. With you, I am a man alive with purpose and passion. I dream of a day when we might walk together in sunlight, when I might claim you openly as my own." But in the same letter, written just paragraphs later, the delusion becomes clear. Of course, such dreams must remain private between us. The world is not ready for the truth of what we share. You must understand that my position requires certain sacrifices, certain discretions. What we have is pure precisely because it exists outside the corrupt institutions of marriage and society. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Here was a man who built his political career on the argument that slavery was a positive good, that black people were naturally inferior and needed white guidance to survive. Yet in private, he was writing love letters to a black woman, praising her intelligence, her wisdom, her strength. He was seeking her counsel on political matters, sharing his deepest fears and ambitions, treating her as an equal in every way, except the one that mattered most, her freedom. As months turned to years, the relationship deepened and darkened. Celeste became pregnant twice, bearing Calhoun 2 children who would grow up as slaves in their father's house. Light-skinned children who inherited their father's sharp features and their mother's grace, walking contradictions to everything Calhoun preached in public. He provided for them quietly, ensuring they received better food, gentler treatment, even rudimentary education. But he could never acknowledge them, could never give them his name or his protection beyond the walls of the plantation. The psychological toll on Celeste was immense. She watched her children grow up calling another woman mother, saw them bow their heads when their father passed, witnessed the man who claimed to love her treat their offspring as valuable property rather than family. The letters she wrote back, discovered hidden in a false bottom of an old trunk, reveal a woman fighting to maintain her sanity in an impossible situation. "John," she wrote in one letter, using his first name in an act of quiet rebellion. "You speak of love while I remain in chains. You promise freedom while my children learn to call you master. You say I am your heart's desire while your wife sleeps in silk and I sleep on straw. If this is love, then love is just another word for cruelty dressed in pretty clothes." The political implications of the affair were staggering. Calhoun was not just any Southern politician. He was the intellectual architect of states' rights theory, the philosophical foundation of Southern secession. His speeches about racial purity and the divine nature of slavery were quoted in newspapers across the nation. He was the South's most articulate defender of human bondage, arguing that it was not just economically necessary, but morally superior to the wage slavery of the North. Yet here he was, living proof that the system he championed was built on lies. His private life revealed what abolitionists had long argued, that slavery was not about racial superiority, but about power and exploitation, that the men who claimed to be protecting white womanhood were the same ones preying on black women, that the institution they called a positive good was actually a machinery of rape and psychological torture, disguised as paternalistic care. The letters also reveal Calhoun's growing paranoia as his political enemies began to circle. Rumors were spreading through Charleston's gossip networks, Servants talked, neighbors whispered, political rivals investigated. The nullification crisis had already damaged his relationship with President Jackson, and whispers about his personal life threatened to destroy him entirely. In one particularly revealing letter, Calhoun wrote to a political ally about the need to silence what he called malicious gossip about his household. "There are those who would use any weapon against our cause," he wrote, "including lies about the moral character of our leaders. We must be vigilant against such slanders, for they seek not just to destroy individuals, but to undermine the very foundations of our society." Oh, the irony was perfect. Calhoun was calling the truth about his own behavior a lie designed to undermine Southern society. He was so deep in his own hypocrisy that he couldn't recognize reality anymore. The man who claimed moral authority over an entire region had become a walking contradiction, a living example of everything wrong with the system he defended. But the scandal was about to explode in ways that would shake the foundations of American politics. Because Celeste was not just Calhoun's secret lover. She was also keeping secrets of her own, secrets that would expose a network of corruption, blackmail, and political manipulation that reached into the highest levels of government. The winter of 1839 brought more than just bitter cold to the Calhoun plantation. It brought whispers that travelled faster than wildfire through the servant quarters, through the drawing rooms of Charleston, through the marble halls of Washington itself. Because Celeste had discovered something that would transform her from victim to power broker, from property to puppet master, in a game that could topple governments. Hidden beneath loose floorboards in study, she found documents that reveal Calhoun's privated the true scope of his corruption. Not just love letters and personal confessions, but evidence of a conspiracy that reached into every corner of Southern politics. Bank records showing bribes from cotton merchants. Correspondence with foreign agents discussing cotton trade agreements. Most damning of all, detailed plans for what he called the Great Expansion, a scheme to extend slavery into territories that would tip the balance of power permanently toward the South. But Celeste was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived years earlier. 3 years of living in the shadows of power had taught her to read more than just words on paper. She understood the language of influence, the currency of secrets, the terrible mathematics of leverage. She began making copies, hiding evidence in places only she knew about. Because somewhere in those sleepless nights between his visits, between his promises and his lies, she had realized a truth that would change everything. She was not his property. He was hers. The transformation didn't happen overnight. It began with small tests, subtle challenges to his authority that revealed just how desperate he was to keep her quiet. When she requested better quarters for herself and the children, he complied immediately. When she asked for books, for writing materials, for freedoms no slave should possess, he granted every request without question. Fear had made him generous, and generosity had made him weak. Celeste began attending to guests in the parlor, serving tea while powerful men discussed matters of state. They spoke freely around her, these titans of Southern society, because in their minds she was furniture with ears. They had no idea that every word was being memorized, catalogued, stored away for future use. She learned which senators were taking bribes, which judges could be bought, which newspaper editors were in Calhoun's pocket. She discovered that the moral crusade for Southern rights was actually an elaborate criminal enterprise disguised as political philosophy. The letters she intercepted revealed conversations between Calhoun and his associates that would have horrified even his supporters. Plans to intimidate Northern journalists, schemes to manipulate cotton prices to force economic dependence, detailed strategies for provoking conflicts that would justify Southern secession. Most shocking of all, discussions about expanding slavery not just westward, but into the Caribbean, into South America, creating what they called a tropical empire built on human bondage. But the most explosive discovery came in March of 1840, when Celeste found correspondence between Calhoun and agents of the British Crown. The great champion of American sovereignty was secretly negotiating with foreign powers to support Southern independence in exchange for favorable trade agreements. The man who thundered about Northern betrayal was himself plotting treason on a scale that dwarfed any accusation he had ever made against his enemies. Armed with this knowledge, Celeste began to change the nature of their relationship. No longer passive, no longer simply enduring his attention, She became an active participant in conversations about politics, about strategy, about the future of the South. Calhoun, drunk on what he believed was love, began sharing state secrets with his slave mistress. He showed her classified correspondence, discussed confidential meetings, revealed the inner workings of conspiracies that could reshape the nation. What he didn't realize was that every secret he shared made him more vulnerable, more dependent on her silence, more terrified of her potential betrayal. The balance of power in their relationship had shifted completely. She was no longer his property to be used and discarded. She had become his partner in crime, and partners in crime always know too much. The psychological dynamic became increasingly complex. Calhoun genuinely believed he loved Celeste, but his love was built on a foundation of ownership and control. When that control began to slip, when she started asserting herself as an equal participant in their relationship, his emotions became volatile and unpredictable. He would swing between passionate declarations of devotion and cold reminders of her status as property, between promises of eventual freedom and threats of punishment if she ever betrayed his trust. Celeste played her role perfectly, feeding his delusions while carefully documenting every moment of weakness, every slip of tongue, every piece of evidence that could destroy him. She had learned to read his moods, to anticipate his needs, to provide exactly the combination of submission and intelligence that kept him dependent on her presence. She became indispensable, not just as a lover, but as a confidant, a counselor, a keeper of secrets, too dangerous for anyone else to know. The children complicated everything. Their son, born in 1838, had inherited Calhoun's distinctive jawline and piercing eyes. Their daughter, born 2 years later, possessed her mother's grace, but her father's stubborn intelligence. Both were living contradictions to everything Calhoun preached about racial purity and natural hierarchy. They were proof that the boundaries between races were artificial constructs, that the system of slavery was built on lies about biological differences that simply didn't exist. Calhoun provided for them in ways that revealed his true understanding of their humanity. He ensured they received education, medical care, protection from the worst abuses of plantation life. But he could never acknowledge them publicly, could never give them the recognition they deserved as his children. They existed in a liminal space between slavery and freedom, between black and white, between acknowledged and denied. The psychological impact on these children would echo through generations. They grew up knowing they were different from other slaves but not understanding why. They sensed their father's presence in their lives but could never call him father. They inherited intelligence and ambition, but were trapped in a system that denied them any opportunity to use their gifts. They were living symbols of the contradictions that would eventually tear the South apart. As the 1840 presidential election approached, the stakes became higher and the secrets more dangerous. Calhoun was positioning himself as the intellectual leader of Southern resistance to federal authority. His speeches grew more inflammatory, his rhetoric more extreme, his demands more uncompromising. He was building a political movement that would culminate in secession and civil war, and Celeste was documenting every step of the process. But she was also planning something that would shock even her. Because hidden among all those stolen documents, buried in the correspondence between powerful men who thought themselves untouchable, she had found something that changed everything. Evidence of a plot so audacious, so destructive, that it would make the eventual civil war seem like a minor disagreement. And she was going to use it. The mansion grew quieter as winter deepened. Guests visited less frequently. Political meetings moved to more secure locations, and Calhoun became increasingly paranoid about security. He installed new locks, hired additional guards, and began conducting sensitive conversations in locations where he believed no one could overhear. What he didn't realize was that the greatest threat to his secrets lived under his own roof, shared his own bed, and bore his own children. Celeste had become something unprecedented in the history of American slavery. Not just a victim who had learned to survive, but a strategist who had learned to thrive. Not just a woman fighting for her own freedom, but an agent of change who could reshape the course of history. The scared girl who had arrived at the plantation was gone, replaced by someone far more dangerous to the system that had created her. A woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The documents she had been collecting weren't just evidence of corruption. They were a roadmap to revolution, a blueprint for tearing apart the United States itself. Because what Celeste had uncovered in those late-night raids through Calhoun's private papers wasn't just treason, it was genocide disguised as political philosophy. Hidden behind false walls and buried beneath floorboards, she found correspondence that revealed the true scope of what Calhoun and his associates called the Southern Solution, not just the expansion of slavery into new territories, but the systematic elimination of free black populations throughout the South. Detailed plans for what they termed ethnic cleansing, written in the clinical language of men who saw human beings as mathematical problems to be solved. The letters were signed by governors, senators, judges, and military officers. Men whose names graced university buildings and city squares. Men who attended church every Sunday and quoted scripture about Christian charity. Men who were planning the largest act of racial violence in human history, all while maintaining their public personas as defenders of civilization and moral order. One document, dated December 3rd, 1840, laid out the timeline with horrifying precision. Phase 1 involved the systematic re-enslavement of free blacks through legal manipulation and false accusations. Phase 2 called for the forced relocation of mixed-race populations to what they euphemistically called work camps in the Caribbean territories. Phase 3, the most chilling of all, outlined the complete elimination of what they termed genetic contamination through methods too brutal to fully comprehend. Celeste read these plans by candlelight in the servants' quarters, her hands shaking as the full horror became clear. They weren't just planning to preserve slavery. They were planning to perfect it, to create a racial hierarchy so absolute that it could never be challenged again. And at the center of it all was the man who whispered sweet words of love in her ear while plotting the murder of millions who looked like her. The psychological toll was devastating. Every kiss from Calhoun became a betrayal. Every gentle touch felt like the caress of death itself. She was sharing a bed with a man who was planning the systematic extermination of her people while telling her she was special, different, somehow exempt from the fate he was designing for others. The cognitive dissonance was enough to drive anyone mad, but Celeste had learned to transform pain into power, horror into strategy. She began making contact with networks she had only whispered about before. The Underground Railroad had agents even in Charleston, servants and freed blacks who moved information as efficiently as they moved human cargo. Through careful conversations and coded messages, she began feeding intelligence to abolitionists in the North. Not just about Calhoun's affair, but about the conspiracy that threatened to turn the entire South into a killing field. The irony was perfect. The same literacy that Calhoun had praised in private letters, the same intelligence he had celebrated as proof of her exceptional nature, was now being used to document his crimes and share them with his enemies. She was becoming exactly what he feared most, an informed black woman with access to power and the will to use it. But Celeste's plans went beyond simple exposure. She had learned too much about power to settle for mere revenge. She wanted transformation, the complete destruction of the system that had created monsters like Calhoun. And she had discovered something in those stolen documents that could accomplish exactly that. Financial records showing that the entire Southern economy was built on fraudulent loans from northern banks. Evidence that plantation owners had been systematically defaulting on debts while hiding assets in foreign accounts. Proof that the wealth of the South, the foundation of their political power, was actually a house of cards that could collapse with the right pressure applied at the right moment. Celeste began copying everything, creating a complete archive of Southern corruption that could destroy not just individual politicians, but the entire economic system of human bondage. She worked by moonlight, hiding documents in places only she knew about, building a case so comprehensive that no court could ignore it and no politician could survive it. The winter of 1841 brought changes that made her work both more urgent and more dangerous. Calhoun's political enemies were closing in, asking questions about his finances, his associations, his private life. Federal investigators were beginning to probe the network of corruption she had been documenting. The conspiracy was unraveling, and desperate men were becoming increasingly violent in their attempts to protect their secrets. 3 servants disappeared that winter. Officially, they had run away, but Celeste knew better. She had seen the fear in their eyes, heard the whispered warnings about asking too many questions or being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The plantation was becoming a fortress, and fortresses were built to keep secrets in as much as enemies out. But Celeste had advantages that other potential witnesses lacked. Her relationship with Calhoun gave her protection and access that no other slave possessed. She could move through the house freely, attend meetings that others were barred from, overhear conversations that would have gotten anyone else killed. Her intimate knowledge of his psychology allowed her to manipulate his emotions, to keep him dependent on her presence even as she documented his crimes. The children became both her greatest vulnerability and her strongest motivation. Every time she looked at them, she saw the future that Calhoun's conspiracy would destroy. They were living proof that racial boundaries were artificial, that the hierarchies he defended were built on lies. But they were also targets, mixed-race children, who would be among the first victims if his plans succeeded. She began making arrangements for their protection, reaching out to contacts in the Underground Railroad who specialized in moving children to safety. It broke her heart to consider separation, but she knew that her mission was bigger than her personal desires. If she could expose the conspiracy and prevent the genocide, the sacrifice would be worth it. The spring of 1841 brought news that changed everything. Abraham Lincoln, the prairie lawyer who had been making speeches about slavery, was gaining national attention. Northern newspapers were beginning to question not just the expansion of slavery, but its continued existence. The political landscape was shifting in ways that made Calhoun's conspiracy both more urgent and more vulnerable. Celeste realized that timing would be crucial. Release the information too early, and the conspirators would have time to cover their tracks and eliminate witnesses. Wait too long, and they might succeed in implementing their plans before anyone could stop them. She needed to coordinate with forces beyond the plantation to become part of a larger movement that could use her intelligence effectively. The letters she began sending north were masterpieces of strategic communication. Written in code and hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence, they provided abolitionists with detailed intelligence about Southern military preparations, financial vulnerabilities, and political divisions. She became a spy in the truest sense, gathering and transmitting information that could change the course of history. But her most important discovery was yet to come. Because buried in the deepest layer of Calhoun's secret files, she found evidence of something that would make everything else pale in comparison. Communications with foreign powers that went far beyond simple trade agreements. Military alliance proposals that would bring European armies to American soil. Plans for a war that would tear the nation apart and rebuild it according to principles that would make slavery seem merciful by comparison. The scope was breathtaking. Calhoun wasn't just planning Southern independence, he was planning to create a new kind of nation, a racial empire that would serve as a model for the rest of the world. The correspondence with British agents revealed discussions about using American slaves as soldiers in a global war against what they called racial mixing and democratic chaos. But most shocking of all were the letters to German intellectuals who were developing what they called racial science. Calhoun was funding research into biological weapons that would target specific genetic markers. He was supporting experiments in what would later be called eugenics, but applied on a scale and with a ruthlessness that anticipated the horrors of the 20th century. Celeste stared at these documents until her eyes burned, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what she had uncovered. This wasn't just about slavery or even about American politics. This was about the future of human civilization, about whether the world would be divided into racial castes, maintained by scientific brutality, or united by principles of equality and human dignity. The weight of responsibility was crushing. She held in her hands information that could prevent a Holocaust, but only if she could find a way to use it effectively. The wrong move could get her killed and the evidence destroyed. The right move could save millions of lives and change the trajectory of human history. As summer approached, Calhoun's behavior became increasingly erratic. The pressure of maintaining his public persona while orchestrating his secret conspiracy was taking its toll. He drank more, slept less, and became paranoid about loyalty and betrayal. His treatment of Celeste began to shift from possessive affection to suspicious surveillance. He started testing her, asking leading questions about her activities, her conversations with other servants, her opinions about political developments. She could sense him watching her more carefully, checking to see if documents had been moved, listening at doors to overhear her conversations. The man who had once trusted her completely was beginning to see her as a potential threat. The transformation was both predictable and terrifying. As the stakes grew higher and the risks more desperate, Calhoun was reverting to the fundamental logic of slavery. She was property, and property that became inconvenient could be disposed of. All his romantic delusions about their relationship were crumbling under the pressure of political necessity. But Celeste had been preparing for this moment. She had contingency plans, escape routes, and allies who could protect her if necessary. More importantly, she had completed her mission. Every document had been copied, every secret recorded, every piece of evidence safely hidden in locations beyond Calhoun's reach. The conspiracy had been fully exposed, and the information was already making its way to people who could use it to prevent catastrophe. The final confrontation was coming, and she was ready. The morning mist hung thick over the plantation as Celeste made her last rounds through the house, memorizing details she would never see again. The grandfather clock that chimed every hour of her captivity, the portraits of Calhoun ancestors who had built their fortune on human suffering, the dining room where powerful men had planned genocide while she served their tea and recorded their words. Everything was in place. The documents were hidden. Her children were safe with Underground Railroad agents who would spirit them to freedom in Canada. Her testimony had been recorded and sealed, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The network of abolitionists and federal investigators knew exactly what they were dealing with and how to respond. But there was one final piece of evidence she needed. One last secret that would complete the picture and ensure that justice would be served. Because Calhoun had promised her something in those early days of their relationship. Something that would prove his hypocrisy beyond any possible doubt. He had promised her freedom, not just verbally, but in writing. Legal documents that would have emancipated her and their children. Papers that he had drafted but never signed. Promises that he had made but never intended to keep. Those documents were locked in his private safe, and she knew exactly how to get them. The revelation of what she had planned would shake the foundations of American society. The exposure of Calhoun's conspiracy would prevent a genocide and preserve the Union. And the story of how an enslaved woman had outmaneuvered the most powerful politician in the South would inspire generations of freedom fighters. But first, she had to survive the next 24 hours. The clock struck midnight as Celeste moved through the darkened hallways of the mansion, her bare feet silent against the polished wooden floors. Every creak of the old house seemed to echo like thunder in her ears. Every shadow held the potential for discovery and death. She had memorized the patrol patterns of the guards, counted the seconds between their rounds, studied the rhythm of their breathing when they dozed at their posts. In her hand, she clutched a small iron key, cold and heavy with possibility. She had stolen it 3 days earlier from Calhoun's coat pocket while he slept off another night of whiskey and political plotting. The key to his private safe, the repository of secrets that could topple governments and reshape nations. Tonight, she would claim the final piece of evidence that would complete her mission and secure her revenge. The study door stood slightly ajar, moonlight filtering through heavy curtains to cast pale rectangles across the Persian carpet. Calhoun's desk sat in darkness, papers scattered across its surface like fallen leaves. But Celeste wasn't interested in the correspondence that lay in plain sight. She needed what he kept hidden, locked away behind steel and secrecy in the massive safe that dominated one corner of the room. Her fingers found the lock mechanism in the darkness, guided by memory and desperation. The key turned with a soft click that seemed to reverberate through the house like a gunshot. She held her breath, listening for footsteps, for shouts, for any sign that her intrusion had been discovered. Nothing but the whisper of wind through Spanish moss and the distant sound of waves against the Charleston harbor. Inside the safe, her hands found exactly what she had hoped for and feared to discover. Legal documents bearing the seal of South Carolina, papers that would have granted her immediate emancipation and recognized her children as free citizens of the United States. Calhoun's signature line remained blank, the promises as empty as his declarations of love. But more damning still were the dates on the documents, proof that he had drafted her freedom papers the same week he had written to his co-conspirators about the need to eliminate free blacks entirely. The psychological cruelty was breathtaking. He had dangled freedom before her like a carrot before a mule, never intending to deliver, using hope itself as another form of bondage. While whispering sweet promises in her ear, he had been planning the systematic murder of everyone who looked like her. While praising her intelligence and grace, he had been corresponding with scientists who viewed her people as biological specimens to be studied and eliminated. But there was more. Beneath the Freedom Papers lay documents that revealed the true scope of his financial crimes. Bank statements showing massive loans from northern institutions, money that had been funneled into the conspiracy through a network of shell companies and false identities. Property deeds for plantations that didn't exist. Slave manifests for human beings who had been sold multiple times to different buyers. Shipping records for cotton that had never been grown. The entire Southern economy, she realized, was built on fraud. Calhoun and his associates had been running a massive Ponzi scheme, using future cotton profits to secure loans for current expenses, selling the same slaves to multiple buyers, claiming ownership of land that belonged to others. When the scheme inevitably collapsed, they planned to blame Northern aggression and use the chaos to justify their racial war. Most shocking of all were the insurance policies. Calhoun had taken out massive life insurance policies on his slaves, betting that they would die in the violence he was planning to unleash. He would profit twice from their deaths, first by eliminating what he saw as genetic contamination, then by collecting insurance payments that would fund the next phase of his conspiracy. Celeste photographed every document using a small camera she had acquired through Underground Railroad contacts. The technology was new, experimental, but it allowed her to create permanent records without removing original papers. Each click of the shutter captured another piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin of the system that had enslaved her. But as she worked, she heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps in the hallway, moving with purpose toward the study. Heavy boots that belonged to neither servants nor guests. Armed men coming to check on something or someone. She had been discovered, or worse, betrayed. The footsteps stopped outside the study door. Celeste held her breath, camera pressed against her chest, every muscle frozen with terror. But then the boots moved on, fading into the distance as the guard continued his rounds. She had seconds, maybe minutes before discovery became inevitable. Working faster now, she captured the final documents, each photograph a bullet aimed at the heart of the conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, devastating. When these images reached the right hands, they would not just destroy Calhoun's career or expose his hypocrisy. They would prevent a genocide and save the Union itself. She closed the safe, pocketed the key, and slipped back into the shadows. By dawn, she would be gone, spirited away by Underground Railroad agents who had been waiting for her signal. The documents would find their way to Abraham Lincoln's closest advisors, to newspaper editors in New York and Boston, to federal prosecutors who had been building cases against Southern conspirators. Within months, the scandal would explode across the front pages of every major newspaper in America. Calhoun's political career would be destroyed, his co-conspirators exposed, their genocidal plans shattered before they could be implemented. The man who had built his reputation on moral authority would be revealed as the architect of history's most monstrous conspiracy. But perhaps most importantly, Celeste's story would inspire generations of freedom fighters who learned that even in the darkest circumstances, intelligence and courage could triumph over oppression. She had proven that the enslaved were not property to be owned, but human beings capable of outmaneuvering their oppressors and reshaping history itself. The woman who had entered the plantation as property walked away as an agent of justice, carrying secrets that would help tear down the very system that had created her bondage. And in that transformation, she had shown the world that no chain was strong enough to bind the human spirit when it was armed with knowledge, determination, and an unbreakable will to be free.